Okay, once again, this is the place, and yes, we're having fun. We are starting late, but that was intentional. But we're going to have a lot of fun. We do have several people in, that is in a Google Hangout tonight. I have Daryl. Yeah, he's going to be here, and also Stephen Hoyt, and also Terry Hauser. I mean, he's a wonderful person. He's involved with philosophy of the place all the time, and wow, he writes some things that really make sense to me. So with that said, Daryl, hello, are you doing all right?
I'm doing well. I'm excited about tonight's show because it's always good. The old saying goes, the more the merrier. So it's going to be merry tonight.
Yeah, I like the way that you styled your hair tonight. That looks good.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good look. Did
A little
Tina
more
do that
fun.
for you?
Actually, I did that.
Oh, you did that? Okay, yeah, that'll work. That'll work. Now,
I got a few
Steve,
left.
yeah, okay. Well, let me bring Steven in. I mean, he's anxious to get started. I mean, I've got a fly in the studio, and I did not invite the fly in. And I mean, he doesn't have Chrome, he doesn't have Google or anything, but the fly is in the studio. So it's crazy, okay? Okay, we have a little bit of feedback. Someone may need to put in some earbuds or something that helps with the feedback or whatever. And so let me introduce Steven. Steven, hello.
How's it going?
That's going marvelous, wonderful.
Well, good to be here. Gonna pester everybody with one of my old-time friends, Terry, and see if we can mix it up a little bit on theories of truth. So, you ready?
Well, that's going to be marvelous, wonderful, because I would like to sit back and just take it all in. I've been reading lots and lots of books here lately, and I read one today. I didn't like it at all, and so I'm really, really picky. And Terry, you may have to put on a pair of earplugs or something like that, earphones. I
Do you
think
have
that.
earbuds, Terry?
No. Somewhere, but not the person of cleaning up. One moment, see if I can take the volume down a bit, and that helps.
Yeah, that seems to work really well. Yeah. Hey,
I can hear
welcome.
you. Does that work?
Yeah, that works. Hey, welcome, Terry, to the show. It's an honor to have you.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I really like your stuff on philosophy of the place. I mean, you're really bright. I mean, it's awesome.
If my small finger on my left hand worked better, I'd have less typos too. So there's that.
Okay, why don't you and Stephen take off on theories of truth, and I'll jump in from time to time.
He's just gonna back it up and then drop it off right there. So
Okay, bag it up and drop it off.
I
Okay.
don't know what to do with that.
Hey, let me ask you a question before you get started. My wife says that I need to brighten my teeth. Are they really yellow or brown or what?
Oh, they're like orbit white.
Okay, well, we thought about, we have a fish tank getting an algae eater or something like that in there. It might do well. I don't know. You guys take off.
That might work if you have the kind of teeth that you can pull out.
That's cool. Okay, start it up. I'm listening. I'm all ears.
Okay. Well, first of all, Terry, it's good to actually see you in kind of person. I think we've known each other 11 or 12 years now, maybe.
It's getting up there, yeah.
Yeah. So Terry and I used to run a philosophy website. Well, a Facebook group in philosophy right at the start of when Facebook groups were taken off. And so we tried to get people away from the academic discussions of philosophy and actually apply what they think they know about philosophy so that it's of practical value. And so part of this discussion for me that we're going to have about truth is always going to have a slant towards it that is practical. And so for me, I start the question with what am I doing when I say something is true? And then am I doing more than just asserting and giving reasons for someone else to agree? And that's where other theories, most of epistemology thinks that there's more to it than that. And so I have in mind that, Terry, you can help me out here with what you know of, let's say, 4 main different theories of truth. The first one, of course, is all the way back to Plato, which is basically some sort of idea of correspondence. When we say something is true, what makes it true is that it corresponds to reality, or it's accurate of whatever it's purporting to talk about. Another one is coherence theory, and we'll get into all these, but I'm just going to kind of lay them out there. And deflationary theory is another one. It's one that I'm particularly interested in, but maybe we can kind of roll up into all of those. Maybe what's the just general in your mind? Who's the first person that you can attribute for yourself, Terry, as giving you the best idea of what truth is and what that definition was? It can be your Uncle Sam or your Aunt Patty or Plato. I don't care. Just when did that word take on a meaning for you?
Interesting question, but it probably requires a bit of history. So if I back up a bit, work from there. I grew up poor, and as a result, I grew up in contact with my environment. My dad took me fishing all the time. I was always in nature. I was always exposed to, for lack of a better term, the real world. I mean, arguably the only real thing we have to look at. So I had that going for me, and what I found interesting, because I was a fairly bright kid, the older I got and the more people tried to teach me things, the more they actually removed me from what I was already experiencing and were asking me to buy in something else. And after a while, it came down to a question of whether I was to believe my teachers or whether I was to believe my lying eyes, because, which was the default setting, of course, because when I went away from people and I ceased to be around that influence, all I had was what was in my head, which frequently did not correspond to what I was observing. So the reset, and it helped, the reset for me always came back to, as I said before, do I believe what my teacher said, or do I believe my lying eyes? And it took me a long time to come to trust myself, because I was a kid and growing up. So from there, I spent time and again, background, sorry if it says too much, but we're based on our foundation. My foundation was, my parents argued a lot. They sent me to a Lutheran church. They didn't really teach me a thing, and then they confirmed me. And then I left at 13 years of age as an atheist. Went out into the world and pursued my own way. And I studied all sorts of things. I read voraciously. And I hit a point where I ran into things that really caused me to question my grasp on truth. Then that's where I turned back into a different version of Christianity. That was Jesus movement era. I got involved in a large church. They were supercharged. They had the Bible. They were really into that. I spent some mission time down in Mexico, and I thought, well, this is something I could do with my life. Somewhere in the middle of all that, I started to realize that there was no correspondence between what I was being taught and once again, between what I was being taught in the church and what I was seeing in the real world. And even to the point, and I know Dr. Jones frequently speaks about the fact that the Bible isn't technically correct. You you can't really do a translation. What you typically are doing is you're doing a transmutation of languages. You're not doing a translation of languages. So by the time you go through a couple thousand years of time or more, and a couple language jumps, all they had was the general idea, and they weren't even corresponding to the general idea. So somewhere in the middle of all that, I just left. It became too much, and I left. And I was back to finding truth on my own, and I found the most. At that point, I had a book burning, to be frank. I went out and I destroyed many of the Christian books that were just garbage in my life. And I picked things back up, and I quoted it a few times online. I picked up Thoreau and Emerson and started looking at their more tactile approach to the world. And I mentioned it only today to someone online that they're often seen as being these outdoor guys, and they're not outdoor guys, they're philosophers with a tactile approach to the world. So that probably had the greatest influence on my life. C.S. Lewis mattered for a long time until I realized he was just lost in himself, and did a good job of explaining his way out of the paper bag. That's the basis where it became interesting to me.
That's a fantastic answer. For me, when I talk about all this stuff, I'm totally academic. So when I'm quoting philosophers and all that, and you're one of the wonderful things about when you write and you're relaying some kind of truth that is important to you, to someone else, you do that through stories. You tell stories. And most of the people that you're quoting are poets and authors like Thoreau and Camus and Frost and people like that. And it's interesting to me because one of my professors in a class I'm starting up made the remark, opening it up to debate, which is, in order to do philosophy, in order to write philosophy, you have to do philosophy. You have to have read philosophy. And of course I objected, and then my exact response was exactly like how you approach things. It's poetry, it's life experience, and the way you write about it is irrelevant, and the way you talk about it is irrelevant. And there's that sense of truth outside of epistemology that really matters more. What resonates with your experience in terms of language? How are your concepts aiding you or assisting you in understanding your situation and the states of affairs around you? So that's the interesting part of where I connect with you in the whole striving at what we're talking about when we talk about truth. And then we get into the boring stuff, which is, well, how philosophers, what's the history? That's the best a philosopher can do, in my opinion, is be a good historian of ideas. And at best, can relay that in a form of poetry rather than just some kind of academic get you to agree because I'm high-minded paper. That sort of thing. But let's maybe talk about correspondence theory to open up with. And I think in this link that it's going out into YouTube, I think there's already a description of something that I had posted in the Philosophy of the Place this morning, where I quote from Aquinas. That's for the atheists looking on, that, of course, there's no philosophy in theology, and all theologians are dumbasses. So back way in history with St. Augustine, his theory of truth was that truth is what corresponds with reality, in a nutshell. And that there is also, one of his more famous comments was that truth is something that lie between thoughts and reality. And so for correspondence theory, for the most part, there is a property, something that makes a statement true, whether it's a property of a thought or idea about a state of affairs or something about a proposition. But it's the truth maker in formal terms. And so that's the general idea. First of all, there's plenty to pick at. So how does that come across to you as far as being a meaningful way to talk about truth? And do you find any kind of arguments where it falls short and maybe highlight some areas where you think it makes good points.
Okay. Well, I think back, and it was good to work. The time we spent in the initial philosophy group was very good for me, because I held all these ideas like everybody else does. Things I thought were true, things that I thought at least had some kind of truistic value to them. The things that you can sell if you're a good salesman to anybody. And it goes back to that, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with BS. And when you know how to do that, and you can do that in any environment. I spent most of my life as a design build electrician. I built things, really big, complicated things. So I could give you the real answer, and frequently the real answer had something to do with it entailed my doubt. But I could also just lay it on in layers. It would be just lasagna BS, and you'd probably like that more because it was more packaged, it was more finalized. But the real truth was, I was dealing with stuff I didn't understand, and I didn't have anybody to ask. And that's really how we approach most things in the world, I think. We're given these, and I mentioned it before, I whipped it out of the blue because it's the best I could do. In the philosophy group, but I started to realize that truths are like Legos. You're given 100 Legos. You got 10 blue ones, 10 red ones, etc. And they're real Legos. Those are your facts. Those are things that are, for all intents and purposes, irreducible. But you're going to take, and I say, here, Stephen, you build something with this. And then you build it, and I go, well, that's not the truth, and it is your truth. You put your 100 Legos together, good job. Get a gold star. But no one's ever going to assemble those things the same way, especially with no pattern as to how to do it. And I think people go through life doing just that. I think that they're assembling the facts that they have, and even if they're true facts, how they put them together maybe doesn't work for anything practical, but it's still put together, it's still all the facts. And as long as people aren't taking the 3 blue ones and setting them aside, saying, well, that's really inconvenient. That's where the cognitive dissonance comes in. Where you go, that's just not going to fit. There's limestone on the top of Mount Everest, and it really pisses me off because, you can't have a sea floor 27,000 feet in the air and still have a 7,000-year-old world. So you ignore those 3 blue pieces, and then it all works for you. That's relating to something we just discussed tonight on the philosophy of the place. But and I'm trying to answer your question as directly as I can and still tell a story.
Yeah, well, I kind of dumped a big truckload on you to maybe talk
that's
about
okay.
it. But the way that you're approaching it is a lot more interesting than my original question. And it goes back to things. I completely agree, and I think I had mentioned this last week when we were having this similar discussion, which is once you, I believe is a commitment and when we talk about something being true, when we say we're something is true, we're committing in some way to the world being different given that truth. So I'm committing to acting a certain way, whereas if I didn't think something was true, I would act differently. So essentially, the idea with the Legos is perfect because once you start building a shape, you've committed where other pieces are going to go. And I'm not a foundationalist saying that we can track our beliefs all the way back to one grounding belief, but it is in a coherent view where we make certain belief commitments, and where the rest of the beliefs that we have are going to take on a certain character and certain topography, if you will, of all these facts. It's a narrative of the information that we have. And again, that's to say that we can be consistent with our beliefs in the coherent view of things. And so when we start adding Legos, we're going to want it to fit. And if it doesn't fit, we don't know what to do with it. That's sort of echoing that, but the coherentism. The other beliefs that we have make it appear that something is good information or bad information, or what pieces it should be filling in. That those facts, again, though, don't exclude a coherent view from being consistent with correspondence theory. Typically, they're played off against each other. It's either an external view or an internal view, where all of our beliefs are what make us think something is true, and the external world doesn't cause us to believe those things. Where generally, for a correspondence theory of truth, people that adopt that say that, well, our beliefs are appropriate to external facts. So that's the way they typically play off. But I think the way normal human beings go about their business is exactly how you describe things, where you have the world, you have facts, and there's no rules. No one is telling you, no one is going to beat you with a stick if you put different Legos together and see what pans out. What we're trying to do there, I think, is use all of the facts. We're given 100 pieces of Legos. We have to build something with every single piece. And the theories that leave out pieces or have pieces that don't fit, we don't typically give them as much merit as a full picture. However, this is the problem. And I think most people that think through this problem will agree with the coherentist view. You can have sets of ideas, and this is, I'm kind of referring to model-dependent theory. You can have a model, a set of ideas that uses all 100 Legos, and all of them fit into one piece. And you can have another set of a model using all 100 pieces. It looks brilliant, it looks wonderful, and it looks nothing like the other one. In a model-dependent theory, which is sort of in the realm of coherentism, which one is true? The idea of truth under that kind of guise becomes irrelevant, because you can't really judge either one. All you can say is one is more convenient to use than another. And they all have good reasons to use the pieces like they're being used, because they all fit. So anyway, that's to say, I'm trying to, let's say, narrow us down from these more aspiring views of truth, where we hope for some formulaic set of things, criteria that we can look at that will help us discover this magic property called truth. I'm trying to see if anything happens when we let go of that idea and come up with something that's a little bit more practical for everyday use. Certainly the way people talk, I think the way people talk about truth is they want it to be absolute and not be a lot of work, and that it's a property that is discovered and all that. However, given this idea of two different models and truth becoming irrelevant, and they both correspond to reality in exactly the way that we would normally say, what happens to truth under correspondence theory? And I'm trying to bring it around to where you can, again, elaborate in the more poetic way that you have that's more accessible to you than it is to me. Are there concerns in general with the idea that we can formulate or formalize a way of getting at what is the best thing to think or say about any state of affairs? What do you think about that?
Well, that's a good question, for one thing, and I think it sort of goes back to, and I'm sorry if it's oversimplistic, but I think it's a darn good place to start with the Legos. That, and you've seen this, and I'm a bit older than you. Within my lifetime, I sat down in a classroom and had science teachers from the time I was young tell me things I knew better than. And that really troubled me, because they were describing a static state universe when we already knew that wasn't the deal. And kids were fitting North America and Africa together in the map, like, hey, look at that, looks like they actually came apart, and oh, that didn't happen, and then we go, oh, there's plate tectonics, and that was a crazy, I lived when that was a stupid idea. And it turns out that the microcrystalline formations in Scotland and North America are identical. They had to be formed at the same time. So these are proofs that tie it together to show that we were missing the bigger picture. To me, I think that's where you start to have a divergence in people's own paradigms, because they start with only what they know. And we've seen this in back to the static state universe. When I was a kid, the universe was about a galaxy, the Milky Way. Then all of a sudden they went, oh, well, we stuck a telescope in space, and now we've got all these other galaxies to deal with. It's a bigger place than we thought. Then they find the cosmic microwave background and blow the lid off the thing, which also underscores a higher plausibility that the Big Bang, for at least for the time being, is probably how everything started. And if I can't build a universe from expanding plasma at the Big Bang and resolve myself to you and I having this chat tonight, it doesn't work for me. It does not work for me at all. I'm that stubborn and I'm that pedantic. But everyone I meet, practically, a universe, a galaxy, they're all the same thing, those could be little white dots in a lid in the sky for all we know. We're living on a plate and they're all lying to us, and the Antarctica's all the way around the outside and holding us in. So, and here we are, all people on this same sphere or plate or what have you, observing the same things, and we're all deriving such vastly different stories about it. And what limits that story and what changes the correspondence is how far we're willing to look, how much we're willing to incorporate, how much we're willing to, how much we're willing to baffle ourselves, how to walk away and go, shit, I just don't know anything. And I live for that. I love hitting those. I have my whole life, and it seems like everybody else doesn't want to know that there are walls. They're more than happy to be the bat inside, the cat inside of Schrodinger's box. I'm fine in here, or I'm not. Whichever the case may be, just leave the lid on, and we're good. But I've never been able to see it that way. I don't know if that's a gift or a curse or what it is, but because of that superior, meaning elevated view, if you will, I can see when people don't know something. I mentioned online a while back, a man who believed in the flat earth came in, and that's when I was at the counter and obligated to not say bad things, or bad things meaning my opinion. And he was from Texas, he was from your backyard, and he just went on and on and on, and finally said, what do you think about that? I said, well, the astronomical unit is roughly 93 million miles. Of course, that's an elliptical orbit around the sun, so that's only an average. And I laid out, I grabbed this piece of scrap paper out of the garbage can, I grabbed a pen and I drew a picture. And he pounded his fist on the counter and swore and left. And you don't want to hurt people like that, but maybe, he's in your state. Maybe I helped him.
I tell you what, I need to jump in, Terry. I'm sitting back listening to you, and I said, "Wow, this guy needs to be a regular on the place."
Well, I got a camera now.
You have a way of nuancing things through story, which I find to be amazingly put. Can't say enough. I want to inject this, and maybe, Stephen, you can take the ball and run with it. When it comes to the correspondence theory of truth, so many people are saying these days that which comports to reality is truth, right? And so Dr. Burton, I think, gives a reason to question this. And I've said for years, if we say that which comports to reality is truth, or truth is that which comports to reality, there's a bit of something that's missing here. Because isn't it true that that which comports to our interpretation of reality? Let me read what Burton said. He said, when it comes to this so-called correspondence theory of truth, the mind does not perceive reality as it is, but only as it can, filtering, distorting, and interpreting it. And so there is a problem relying, let's say, on the correspondence theory of truth when we simply say truth is that which comports to reality, because reality is a construct, right?
Well, no, reality is what reality is. Our constructs are what we're talking about.
Well, I'm talking about within our brain, we have constructed reality, is my point.
Yes.
Okay, so within the brain, we have constructed reality, and so it's basically I mean, when we talk about heuristics, the algorithms, and our hermeneutic, what kind of interpretation do I have of reality? That plays a big, factor in what we're talking about. So when it comes to me knowing truth or someone else knowing truth, interpretation has a lot to do with it, correct?
Oh, absolutely. That's usually a common complaint, but I'll tell you the way most correspondents, most people that like the correspondence theory will say that there's the coherentist argument is exactly what you just said, but the complaint, the objection there is simply that even though we are interpreters of states of affairs, that does not mean that when we assert that P corresponds, that P does or does not correspond. So it doesn't really affect correspondence theory complaining that it may or may not be actually true that P corresponds. So the real problem for correspondence theory is simply that there's nothing to say about P corresponding to reality. We don't know what that looks like. We don't know, except for testing, devising some tests to say, here is how we know P corresponds. All we can say is that there are better ways to describe a state of affairs than the way we're currently describing them, if that makes sense. So it's kind of neutered that way because in order to say that P corresponds, you have to have something formulaic or something objective to say, because of X, Y, and Z, we know that P corresponds and P is true of this state of affairs. But at that point, what you've done is entered into what epistemology has become in postmodern times, which is P being true. Any proposition, let's say we give the letter P. P is true not because it corresponds and not because it's coherent. It's because of the reasons that exist for thinking that way. To think that P is true, or to say that P is true, comes with a burden of being able to give good reasons for suggesting that it is. Something has to imply P. And the job of postmodern epistemology is to justify or ground the assertion that P is true. And you cannot do that. This is where, in my view, and Ozzy's great to have this conversation with because he's a correspondence theory person and does a much better job of defending that view than I do of defending it myself. But he openly admits to everyone freely, as he's done before on this show, that that's a problem because he doesn't have that mechanism. There's no mechanism in place to say that even though we may be wrong about P corresponding, we can know that P corresponds. And the whole thing about truth is we want to know things, and so correspondence theory in itself cannot get you to a place where you say you know something. It's because of justification that you can say something corresponds and corresponds accurately or properly or any of the other adjectives that typically go with it. For me, that's what takes me away from either view, whether it's correspondence or coherent theory.
Okay,
it's more about the modern gist of talking about truth in terms of justification.
perhaps
Maybe
we
I'll open it back up for you to comment more and redirect.
perhaps we could look at this from a different vantage point. Some say the truth of something lies at the end of our inquiry into that thing. But as our inquiry can have no end, the truth of something can never be more than our best opinion of that thing. And see, that goes back to the interpretation that I was talking about. If best opinion is all that we can have or hope for, then best opinion is as good as truth, and truth is a redundant concept.
Yes, I'm trying to guess who would write that, but yes, that's perfectly good. Truth is often seen as normative. There's truth as a description, which is, I think, what correspondence theory wants to do: describe the conditions under which something is true, or we recognize
Okay.
something is true.
Now,
But like you're saying, it's more normative. It should be, this is what ought to be the set of circumstances, or these are our aspirations. our opinions. These are our the way things should fit together. Should be this. Now let's look for it, and does it pan out? I think that's the way
Right.
we're typically.
Now, this
set
is
up.
simply Burton redacting lots of things that were said in times past, and with some of the things that are being measured in theory, that is, in various disciplines. But I think that it's worth stating again: the truth of something lies at the end of our inquiry into that thing. And when we look at the various models of truth, whether it be correspondence theory of truth, coherence, or consensus, or even deflationary, something has to be said in this kind of context for it to make sense. And this is one of the things that I really love about Terry being on the show. He puts stuff in simple, manageable stories to where it really it seems to come alive, right?
Oh yeah, he says things way better than I can. I'm too technical and too academic, and he'll Terry, you do a great job of slicing up the world in bite-sized pieces where everybody gets it.
I didn't mean to butt in. I just thought I'd throw just this or that in. I thought,
If I may, Dr. Jones, just a quick observation.
yes,
You're saying that truth, actual truth, is at the end of our rhetorical or verbal search for it, but I think that's the problem. That when we take, I picked my first tomato. I don't live in Florida or Texas, so I picked my first tomato today, and I went out there and I had that other thing I've done all year. It's my crowning achievement for this year so far, on August 21st, is to eat that tomato. And this was a large grape tomato, but you can't reduce that. Nothing I could say. I could write poetry about it. I could write a song. It wouldn't be a very good song, but I could write the song. And still I couldn't give you that tomato, but that tomato to me, the risk of being, telling a story, that tomato is the truth. It exists. They're out back behind me right now. You can see them out there. They're about 10 feet back in the night. and they exist. They're real. They're real whether I show up, whether I put them into words, or more correctly, attempt to put them into words or not. And I think that's where we fail. But where we fail is where we also have to learn how to succeed, because that's where we have to connect with other people. So we have that paradox that we're always warring against. We have to find the words, and yet we know even while we're looking for the words are going to fail us. And it's maddening, but the challenge itself is fantastic.
I've stated for years that we have a perspective of truth, not truth itself. Truth is something that we're trying to reason out. And at the end of the day, we have various theories. And so that's why I wanted to quote some of the works of Dr. Burton tonight, because I think that he's simply trying to look at this in a very simple way, and I think it makes sense. And so it keeps people a bit skeptical, and maybe I'm too much of a skeptic here when it comes to true theory. But put something on the table, Stephen, that would really push me back.
Oh, I don't know about pushing you back. I think.
Come on, I need to be pushed back on. I mean, hard.
Well, let me warm up, okay?
Okay, love that big smile. And I love the tomato story. I mean, I love tomato sandwiches, and I love fried green tomatoes. And I have a restaurant in Pensacola. Anyone who comes here, I will take you to that restaurant, because they actually fry green tomatoes, and they serve the best oyster Rockefeller there that you've ever tasted. So let's move on.
Tomatoes are good. I think, and again, I wrote about this just a couple days ago, that when we get away from what Terry's offering, where I'll call that philosophy is poetry, and of course my favorite author, thinker, Richard Rorty, has a collection of writings under that title. When we get away from philosophy as poetry, what we become are academics that are, when you hear the word philosopher, that's what you think of. Someone that's irrelevant to anything that actually matters. And often I find myself prone to being in that role, playing that part, and I'm fine with it, because hopefully I iron out some different ways that direct the way people are thinking, not towards any specific thing, but a trajectory of how to think more clearly about whatever the subject is. And what Terry is talking about is more relevant than that. I think it's more poetic. There's this intuition that we have about the world that technically doesn't get captured with correspondence theory. It doesn't technically get captured in its entirety with coherence theory. Certainly, and not even philosophers take consensus theory seriously outside of it being an ideal, that we recognize the truth, and because we recognize the truth, everyone will have a consensus because everyone will agree to it. They'll see the light. In other words, that's about as seriously as you can. It's again normative. It's hopeful. It's what ought to happen when we say something is true. We gather a consensus, and it should conform to our existing beliefs, and it should correspond to reality. All of those things are the aspirations that we have, like you're talking about, with this search for truth. But it comes across impractically when we slice and dice it up into the language world and try to put something fixed to it, because it doesn't work. None of these individually work. And the best that we can do, I think, is something like pragmatic theories of truth or deflationary theories of truth. Here is my experience in the world. Here is how I articulate it. And there's no particular, whether it's a scientific conversation or whether it's a epistemic conversation or whether it's a discussion about, how to A, B, and C. Those are particular kinds of conversation, but what matters about it is can I get you to agree with me for unbiased reasons? And that's what matters about the entire prospect of truth-telling, is that we share a similar world and we have similar ideas about that world. And that might be all there is to the entire pursuit of truth-telling and coming up with practical things to say about the world we live in that make a difference to us. And I think one kind of conversation that helps us do that is a philosophical one. I think another kind of conversation we have is an empirical one of science. And then another kind of conversation we have that none of those also capture is, for most of us, a religious or a spiritual sort of conversation that also helps us with aspects of our experience that none of them individually capture alone. And I think for me, for the application of philosophy, the idea is to become a more rounded person, a more understanding person, and a more humble person, in light of the fact that with the more diligent you are with trying to get into all these different theories, you find that they are all incomplete, and that you have to take the best of most of them and understand the worst of each of them, and then think for yourself, and then see what matches your experience, and then do the best that you can to apply clear thinking to at least for yourself, think that this is, from my experience, this is the best explanation that I can do for the things that I am. And in that, I'm ethical. And in that, I'm being honest with what I know. And so this includes, in the great debate, this includes theists as well as atheists and anybody else that has that acknowledgement of humility and incompleteness, and the more important aspect of, here's my experience, and I have to account for all of the things that just naturally occur to me seem to be the case. One of that is a world without God, and for other people, it's a world with this concept of God. So, whether it's God or the reality of tomato plants growing in your backyard, there's different ways of talking about how to justify saying each of those. Unfortunately, the things that we talk about the most, that are most important, aren't as clear as, here's my hand, and in the backyard I have tomatoes. A lot of them are conceptual. How ought I live among other people in the world, and how should people at large live in a biological world with other concerns rather than just humans and that sort of thing. So that's the importance of why we're having this conversation. But I certainly think the way that Terry approaches talking about the philosophical prospect is a lot more successful than the way I present things, which is typically talking about, well, here's this theory, here's where it's strong, here's where it's weak, on to the next theory, which is exactly what I had in mind if Terry wouldn't have been able to come on tonight. So again, I'm gonna stop talking for a while, Terry, and then from just from that aspect, tell me about your experience. You've been online talking philosophically to all sorts of people, whether they're, we've both talked to PhD doctors in philosophy. We've talked to people that are just ignorant to the topic as can be. And we've talked to smart people and dumb people. What matters, what has made a difference to you in any conversation that you've had that revolves around philosophy, or that people have tried to employ philosophy? What matters in the conversation?
Another good question. Their apprehension of the fact that you're there for real. I think online, especially in writing only. I mean, I'm a real person. I may have had a really bad day, and I sit. I've had a couple, or a couple of years worth, and you sit down and you go, okay, I'm going to be brave enough to log onto Facebook. I'm going to open up a philosophy site, and then somebody's there just to try to make you wrong, and more away from the theist atheist side of things. Though typically we ended up with a lot of people who would identify as atheists when we were dealing with the philosophy group. But we had situations where, I mean, I'm looking at the chart behind you and there, and I think to myself, and that's it. And I remember trying to explain to people two things that really stuck out from all that time. One of them was our preposterously lengthy conversation that math was just a language, and pushing up against people that thought that no, math is the underlying fabric of the universe. No, it's not. It's how we describe the underlying fabric of the universe, because we can't really understand it. It's kind of back to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can't know the speed and the location of anything. So if you can identify either one of those things accurately, you just miserably fail to identify the other. But life is in motion. That's what makes life work. What keeps atoms from collapsing is the spin state of the valence electrons and the other electrons underneath. It electromagnetically repels all matter so that we have a fluffy universe. We have a universe like popcorn, only bigger. And you stop the spin state of those, and all of a sudden, all little mini magnets, and electrons are just bipolar magnets, and everything just goes, and it's all over with. The very fact that things are in motion is what creates a universe. I'm getting somewhere. You go to people saying that scientism, where you have experiments are verifiable, repeatable things you can do it, and they're not. They're just approximations. Somebody puts X amount of this thing and X amount of that thing together, and they get a reaction. They go, there you go. And somebody else tries it somewhere on the other side of the ocean. They go, hey, we got the same results. No, you didn't. You got an approximation of the results. And the recognition, and it's pedantic, and at the risk of this is what I turn into when I put the stories away. It's pedantic, but when you become mercilessly brutal with the truth, or at least veracity, you force yourself into this corner where you have to admit. I mean, and if you did it on the same location, a foot apart, it would still be a foot apart. If you mixed X number of atoms of some particular thing, the spin state, which is what causes electrons to not collapse into the core and everything fall apart or fall together, the spin state of every single electron is going to be different all the time. It's always unknowable. It's always in. But the one thing we can be almost certain of is you can't duplicate, any experiment. You can only approximate it. And I think there's a come to Jesus moment there, where we say to ourselves, okay, it's a really close approximation. I mean, we really measured the heck out of this stuff. We put it together. We were at the same elevation above sea level, etc. But we live in a world and in a universe in motion, and nothing ever happens the same way twice. And I think that the same moment that gives me the ability to just rip somebody to shreds if I have to, with that kind of logic, also gives me the mercy to go, well, and how would you know that? And if you knew that, if I told that to you, what would that do to your heart? You know, what would it take you apart? Some people it puts them together, and some people it rips them apart. And knowing when to be that honest. Because I'm merciless with myself, but I'm never merciless with anybody else. It's just too cruel. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I know that I aimed at answering your question. I don't know if I hit the 10 ring or.
Yeah.
Yep. But
Yeah, no, you're on the money with what I was going for, and you've gone with the negative, what you don't intend to do when you enter into philosophical conversations. What in general, what is your intent when you do? Because it's risky, like you're saying, it's risky to comment to anybody, because what's at stake is exactly, again, what you're saying. You can either build someone up or destroy them, and it's with the same information and with the same intent, you know. So when you go into the conversation, what's it about for you, and then what do you hope happens as a result of that?
well, it's sort of, and we've talked about this, and I've seen this happen even sometimes in the group philosophy of the place, where people just start asking questions. They go, "Oh, please, just make a paragraph. I don't care if it's got 10 questions in it. Just get them all down and let me answer it and go on to, you know, picking tomatoes or whatever it is I'm doing." But I try to enter conversations with people as free of logical fallacies as I possibly can be. I don't give my, and I know that they work for people, and that's the hard thing.
Yeah.
Is know full well that logical fallacies will sell to just about any room. I don't allow myself to do that. So if I do stumble over that line into logical fallacy, it is an absolute mistake on my part. It's me just not caring at the time, but it's never an intent. It's always my intent to try to be as brutally honest as I can with myself, and to, as we used to always have the situation where we would ask people if they made a statement, because we had a huge group and there was a lot of people contributing. If they had a statement, that they would make their statement and then back it with the reasons to support that statement. And that's a great way to have a conversation, but finding people in the real world that you can do that with and not offend them in the process. I have a really good friend, known him for half of my life. His name is Mike. He's my next door neighbor. We've helped each other out, and we're brutally honest with each other. And some of the conversations don't look like we're friends at times, because that's how we engage each other. You know, they'll go, "That's bullshit," and I'll go, and I'll tell, and the thing of it is, if it is, I'll tell him, "Yeah, that is," and it really unsettles him, because he doesn't like me to. He wants me to push back, and I go, "Nope, you're right." But we have to have that level of candor with ourselves, I think, before we can even dare to engage other people at that level. And frankly, you've helped me over the years. You've been an inspiration. We'll call it that. I think that'll be the distillation of our conversations. It's been an inspiration, Stephen, and I thank you so much.
I gotta say, I know you're being kind, just so that everybody's on the same page with Terry and I laughing at each other. We spent the better part of, I don't know, 2 or 3 years having exactly the kind of conversation that he and his neighbor had. Most of the content was swear words, and just telling the other person they didn't, we exhaust ourselves saying how much the other person didn't know, and we were both right. And I can sit back now and say both of us were exactly right with everything that we were saying. But we had 2 completely different perspectives and problems that we were solving. And it dawned on us, I think, that if we try to understand the other person's perspective first, then that might help us see that we're actually employing the very same modes of reasoning and looking and evaluating our reasons for thinking so even-handedly and all these things, and we risked doing that, and then from that point on, our disagreements were still there. They weren't as passionate, because all I had to do was really pay attention to okay, here's how Terry views the world, and of the things that he's just said, what would make the most sense of the world, given these facts and the way Terry looks at the world. And so I understand where he's coming from. That also helps me when I'm trying to explain my perspective. Here's how I have to translate it so it makes sense to Terry, as much sense as it makes to me. Even if he doesn't agree with it, at least he'll know where I'm coming from. For me, that is That is the second most important reason I engage people in any conversation, whether it's online, on Facebook, or here, or in my daily life. It's so that I can be understood. Number two desire. My number one reason for engaging people is to unstick people. People generally have in mind that they what they think is the correct way of thinking, is the absolute way of thinking, and they've got it all figured out, and they cease to think. And for me, that's a tragedy. And maybe I'm irresponsible in thinking and taking it upon myself to force people to think, but I do it anyway because I'm just not ethical, and I tend to be an asshole, which is what Terry is trying to politely get around having to say. But yeah, I am an
I've
asshole.
already told you that. I don't need to do it again.
Yeah, we don't need to go there again. So he knows I'm an asshole. I'm just telling everybody else that that's kind of that's really true, but hopefully in a way that's not mean. At least I'm trying to force people into thinking about the world and their experience so that they get a bigger picture of it. So hopefully at the end of that, instead of being scared, they will open up to even more ways to experience the reality, and life becomes more meaningful for them in that sense. But how successful I am at doing that is debatable, and I have very questionable means of getting there. And so I wouldn't advocate for the way I approach people, but maybe that at least helps people understand that are engaging with me what my motives are. So anyway, I much prefer Terry's methodology in talking about philosophical ideas, and then how to convey those. His hamburger comes with 2 buns and lettuce and tomatoes, and mine you just get the meat and I kind of throw it at you right in your face.
Okay, let me insert a bit. I am a big fan of a poetic approach toward many things. I think that it's very useful. Dr. Dietrich, he seems to think, and let me read what he said. He said, "What if truth is really a collection of feelings and attitudes? Is there anything to truth over and above truthiness? Everyone thinks so, but then why isn't there more agreement? If all truths that we know seem true, and this is true, then how can we distinguish between seeing true and being true?" So he talks about truth versus appearance. He said, what is the difference between X looks right and X is right? The answer is, we say is the former is compatible with X being wrong, the latter isn't. That looks right. Furthermore, not only is X looks right compatible with X being wrong, it is usually possible to find out that X is in fact wrong, if it is. Here's an example. Water is a fundamental element. That was something that seemed right and hence was believed for a long, long time, right? Water was one of the 4 to 5 fundamental elements, along with fire, earth, air, and so on. But it turns out to be incorrect. Water is not fundamental. It is made up of 2 gases, element, hydrogen, and oxygen. So water is a compound. We found this out by discovering and doing chemistry. And so his point is, the trouble with this analysis is that today water as a compound is felt to be just as true as water is a fundamental element. Does that make any sense?
Yep. It does. I'm looking for one of my favorite quotes is from Richard Rorty, and it's essentially saying the same thing. You would think that from Consequences of Pragmatism, where he says, you would think with some theory, like a theory of number or music even, that the more you study it, the more is revealed about it, and there's practical benefit to it. Whereas he says it's not true, not the case with truth. Because at this point, after some over 2,000 years since Thales, we have no more to say about the nature of truth than we have to say than when we started asking the question to begin with. And there's no difference that makes a difference in calling something true than there is in saying the gods are love it because it's pious, or asking whether or not it's pious because the gods love it. It's just irrelevant. There's no difference that makes a difference when we go for those ideas where truth is a property or something that we can get at it that way. When really, what I think both your quote is stating and what Rorty seems to be pointing out is that there's good reasons to say there's good reasons to have the kinds of conversations that we're having, and the best reasons for saying the best things are what allow us to call them the best, and that's about all there is to it. Just norms in conversation, and that may be exactly what it is: our hopes and aspirations of what we make of things.
Well, he went on to say this. He said, and since feeling true is really, at the end of the day, both why truth matters to us and how we judge truth. And in other words, when I talk to psychologists, typically they will say, when a person says they understand something, it's more of an emotion, right? And they get this feeling. And so, we have a lot of people in the great debate, they have these feelings as if X, Y, or Z is true. But, we are trying to look at this through the eyes of philosophy, but we should also look at this through another vantage point, maybe through the eyes of psychologists and so on. And so I'm not convinced that we should explore truth just on one axis alone. This is why I think that multi-axiality is probably the best thing that we have going for ourselves. Being able to, having the capacity to see we can have different axes of thought, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that one of the most important things to understand about doing the work of philosophy is first having a good grasp on some very fundamental understandings or underpinnings of human psychology. And you're exactly right. We have this problem of doxastic involuntarism,
right,
where our beliefs seem to be, by all accounts, caused. And so the best that we can do is with these caused feelings that something is the case, the best that we can do is try and understand them and put them in a perspective. And I think when we start narrating facts of our experience, it's exactly what we're doing. And it may be nothing more than that, which is to make sense of what we feel,
Exactly.
So, yeah, that resonates with me a lot.
Because the background, the premise by which a lot of philosophers worked is based upon what he's saying here. He's simply saying, why do I say that feeling the truth is the real way we judge truth? And he goes on to state, it is undeniable that feeling the truth, the conscious experience of knowing the truth, is a big part of how we know we are in touch with the truth. He said, simply look at your hands. You know that they are your hands and that they are your hands because you feel it. He said, you can feel this truth, not just your hands. And he said, consider something abstract. 2 + 2 = 4. Again, you know that this is true because you simply feel it. And so I think that the discussion needs to be a little bit broader, and I'm glad that you're an advocate of psychology, not just philosophy, because it's a little bit broader, isn't it, when we start approaching these theories of truth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you find that more articulated specifically in moral conversations, where you're generally understanding morality from a natural sentimental side,
right?
Which is the natural compulsion of, in this set of circumstances, here's what I should do, in spirit of rush. And then we also have the rational side of morality, where we know that our natural intuitions aren't always the ones that we should go with, and we have to be reflective of how we feel about the way things are. And for me, I don't draw any distinction when it comes to epistemology. I want to understand the nature of why it is that I feel the way that I do about the world. And when it comes to saying something is true, I want to have been diligent in making sure that those feelings are appropriate. And unless you can account for both, I don't think you're doing yourself anything but disservice. And I don't think that you're properly approaching how we should conduct the business of epistemology. It has to have both features of our natural sentiments and our rational judging the appropriateness of them.
Right. Well, one other statement from this particular psychologist, he said, imagine an individual who utterly lacks the feeling of truth, even though this individual knows many truths. This individual lacks all conscious psychological states that go into feeling the truth. This individual could know things, that is, for example, 1 plus 1 equals 2, but would never feel like she knew things. And so, I mean, this is meaningful to me, to have a discussion that looks at truth and these various theories of truth based upon looking at it, let's say, on more than one axis, okay?
May I comment?
Yeah.
I think that's an extremely interesting idea that you're forwarding there for a couple different reasons. Because, pardon me for going for the low-hanging fruit, but in Plato's allegory of the cave, you have the people who we're assuming from his story that they've been chained their whole lives. All they've ever seen of a tree is some sadistic little jerk behind them holding up a cutout of a tree, and then they see the shadow dance and the cave fall, and they go, "Yep, there's a tree, Bob," and they move along from there. And to them, that is the truth. And within the bounds of their paradigm and within the bounds of the entirety of their experience, that's absolutely the truth. A tree really is that shadow on the cave wall that looks like a cutout of an elm tree or whatever your favorite tree might be.
That's good.
The person who gets out of Plato's cave, dragged out of Plato's cave, I might add, against his will, and after he accustoms himself to the real world, then he has to actually see things and identify them. And he doesn't know what to call them. He doesn't know. Somehow he comes about the idea that indeed this is a tree, and the tree is this fluffy green thing. It's got bugs all over it. Some of the leaves fall off. Some of them go brown. Some new ones are coming on. A tree is a lot like the one in the cave, but it isn't like that at all, really. So now he has his paradigm, and he heads back into the cave, and we know how that one ends up. But here's the deal. When the guy, and we talked about this on the philosophy group before, is outside the cave still inside of the cave? Is there an extension? I think we have a sense, an inherent sense that we know that we haven't got it yet. We know that we've risen above the first paradigm, and we've maybe gone into even a second or a third. And if we hit a third, now we know we really don't have it. If the second paradigm relieved us to the point where we became religious, for instance, and then suddenly we realized that was just a story we told each other, and we all patted each other in the back and sang a song and ate cake. That made us feel pretty good about things. But then later on, we realized that, wow, that we're just a bunch of people telling ourselves the same story, nodding their heads, patting themselves in the back. There's a whole bunch of people out there, they don't believe, they think we're all crazy. As a matter of fact, I can go online and show you they think we're crazy. So as we divest ourselves of these outer rooms, of these entryways to the cave, we eventually get out to the place where either we get to a place where we see things for real as best we can, or we are aware that there's something else still available yet. And when we get to, let's just say we really know we're out of the cave, and now we realize that, I'm in my 60s. I've had laser surgery on my eyes. I was legally blind most of my life, and I wore glasses that were like Coke bottles. I never saw anything even sort of like the way it appears until I finally had the laser surgery. And then, of course, that only tells me that I could probably see better, but this is the best I'm going to get. So my view of, which is arguably the best grasp we have of the universe, my view of everything is just through it, as Feynman said, these little black holes that take in the vibration of the light in the air. And that's how I assess my universe.
Wow.
I've simplified it down to a point where this is the only way I have of knowing and understanding something. And if I'm really philosophically honest and intellectually sound, I have to tell myself this isn't really what it is. There's another room. I'm still stuck in the cave. Albeit at this point, at least I can acknowledge that I'm stuck in the cave, but I have to, in all honesty, hit a point where I can acknowledge that indeed I am stuck. So there's always that other level. And I think that's what you're talking about in part in what you quoted, is that we're always looking at that. Sorry, I'm talking too fast. I know better.
I mean, you're doing a great job. Keep talking.
I think that we know that there's always something more, and something more doesn't mean therefore God. It doesn't mean, and yeah, see, life just springs out of nothingness because we want it to, because that's their story, by the way. That we don't know how life comes about, and we are forced into a point where we have to acknowledge that to move on. There's that point where we're graduating through the levels, and in each level we hit a point where, okay, at this point is where I say that's it, I have to turn around and go back. If you humor me, a small story, and I use this because this for me always is where it comes back in the truth. Yeah, Bruce and I, we were hardcore crazy people. When I was young, we'd go into the wilderness and do just nuts stuff up in the Boundary Waters where it was just raw, rugged, evil, harsh wilderness, and we just played in it. We went on a kayak trip in a rainstorm, 4 or 5 foot seas, and we're crossing this big lake, not in Boundary Waters, but in Voyageurs National Park. We turned down this bay, and it was long, and I had glasses then too. Downpour rain, 4 or 5 foot waves, everything you can do to keep from swamping. And the wind got to our backs, and it blew us down this bay. And as we're going down the bay, I look in the water, and I see submergent vegetation in the water, and I know that the bay is supposed to be like 30 feet deep, and then I shouldn't be able to see any submergent vegetation, which means we're going the wrong way. So somewhere in the middle of that storm, I had to get to Bruce, show him my map, not capsize, convince him that we were going the wrong way, turn around and go back out. And we fought for about 2 hours, and that was with youthful arms, to get out of the bay, to get around the point and go down the right bay. And there's a point I think we hit in life where we want this bay to be the one. We don't really care. If that results and we went the wrong way, well, then we'll go the wrong way tomorrow morning. But for today, we're going to go this way, and we'll deal with our mistake later. And we know it's a mistake all the way. The moment you know it's a mistake, you have a personal moral imperative to rectify your course. But rectifying your course can be brutally difficult. But the alternative is fatalistic. So it is a difficult thing to face. I'm sorry, I'm going on a link here again.
No, I love to hear you speak. Where have you been?
You stuck me in front of church and let me do this for a while. So.
Daryl, say something.
Well, I've just been soaking it all in, and as a result, I've got 3 different comments. First of all, someday I need to see Stephen Hoyt in action because I've never yet seen him be an asshole, so I'm missing something here.
You can do it.
One day I guess I'll get to experience that. But to go on to something a little more serious here, what I'm hearing tonight just seems to make me more committed to a process rather than a conclusion. I mean, that's what I keep hearing, that this is a process, and the more of this we experience, the more we're actually experiencing life. And I love the analogy of gosh, I'm having a brain part here, the little pieces, what are they called? Legos. There we go. Because it's as if we're building something here, and I think the importance of what's being talked about here tonight is so underrated. We could be talking about good foods or good movies or any number of things, but I think what's being discussed here tonight is the thing that possibly people need the most. I think most people's Legos are just in a pile and they don't even realize it. And until we actually start building something that has meaning, that has value, that causes us to really live in this world in the way that in a way that we can, and become more connected to one another, then I think we are stuck in the mud. And I really appreciate guys that are trying to get people unstuck. And I guess that's where I'm having the problem with the asshole idea. That seems like a noble thing to me.
Okay, Stephen, it's time for you to be an asshole. Go for it.
Well,
Give me a word.
I got a long list of people that will give you an example of that, both of you guys. But anyway, yeah, I don't know that you should always be pushing people where they don't want to go, or you know, and I should be more subtle when I try and do it. But yeah, that's the way it is. But I, for me, I'll just tell you well, I'll just leave it at it's your whatever you want to get out of the conversation. You got to be willing to do it really, really well. And sometimes that means having a variety of techniques to get your point across. And I'm not afraid of using any of them. So anyway, it's horrible. So.
Now, this psychologist,
Of course, that's what I identify most with Terry, what you just said, and that's exactly that was on point. So.
I really love these stories tonight. We're out of time, actually, but let's do this again soon. Terry, would you come back?
Absolutely. More than a half-minute notice would be cool.
I mean, at the end of the day, we didn't really define truth or nail it down, and that doesn't bother me. In times past, I would have to go back to something like this. Let me pull it up because I wanted to read this tonight because I think it's important that we actually find out what truth is. I'm trying to go back to this Billy Graham quote. He said that all truth is found, in Jesus. I can't remember the quote. He said something like, if you want to know all truth, find Jesus. And so, with that said, that must be truth.
Okay.
No one's going to laugh? Come on. I thought that was...
I was bickering.
It would have been better for Jesus for you to come at a time when they had Legos, because they could have done something with that.
That's true.
But I'm glad that Terry didn't. I like what Terry did.
Truth is what resonates with what makes sense of our experience, and if Jesus is the full human experience, then maybe he's got a point, but I don't think that he meant it that way at all. So I think he was just, as Lily Tomlin would say, if that's the answer, of course she's talking about if love is the answer, but I'm going to adapt what Lily Tomlin said. If Jesus is the answer, then you're asking the wrong question.
Now, this particular psychologist, he states it this way. He said, the deepest thing that we know about truth is that we feel it. Our consciousness is the key to our being able to learn, think about, and use what we feel is the truth. The deepest thing we know about consciousness is that it is completely mysterious. We have no good theories of what it is, and no way in the future of finding such theories. That's maybe true. In particular, we have no way to ground consciousness in brain processes. So on he goes. And so he's very, very skeptical about, truly trying to define what truth is. And so with that said, this has been good. Terry, amaze us with one last story. I mean, I love your tomato stories. That last story that you told, that really hit me. I mean, I almost teared up, to be honest with you. I mean, share something with us.
Sure. And we've all moved at least beyond Christianity to a point. And you say that, and the one thing that came to my mind when you were saying something about Jesus, and we all kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more. We know that he probably lived. We know that what we have in those stories in the Bible probably isn't exactly what happened, but it doesn't make the stories any less compelling or any less fascinating. I think And some of those things I wish happened, even if we didn't get the right rendition of it.
Sure.
And the thing that came to mind when you were saying that, Dr. Jones, was when he scribbled in the sand, the woman taken in adultery. And he let's just pretend for a moment that actually happened.
Yeah.
I want to know what he wrote in the sand. He didn't say a word. I want to know what that was. I really do. Because he changed her world. He gave her life back. And he took the religious and set them on their heels, and he didn't say a word. There has to be a point. In my mind, there has to be a point. It's a goal. It's a philosophical and a personal goal to come to that point where you can change a situation by your very disposition. Putting it in words, not so much. It's extremely difficult, but there's my story, the one I borrowed.
I like that.
I love that story simply because he states, he said, I don't condemn you. I love that. And one of the things that we are trying to do here in Pensacola is build meaningful community. And we're trying to do this with so many different people who are so dysfunctional. That's difficult to do. With that said, Stephen, I want you to challenge everyone here tonight academically, okay? I want you to say one of the brightest things that is in a context that would even challenge Ozzy to rethink something concerning truth. Go for it. No pressure. No pressure.
Yeah, we'll get in like 2 seconds worth of talking to what the definition of truth is. There isn't one. So my challenge for an academic like Ozzy or Dylan or any of the other people with advanced degrees in philosophy would be this. We have make claims about those experiences, and it seems to me that when we say something is true, what allows us to do so is the justification that we provide. And the challenge is in saying that if you adopt some other theory of truth, was anything else required than what I just described? Does your theory do anything more than is necessary to saying something is true? For me, it's deflationary. When I say something is true, I give reasons for it, and we accept or reject the truth, in quotes, of that proposition based on how we're liking the reasoning. If there's more to truth than that, then I would like to see it. And that's the challenge that epistemology has been unable to provide for more than 2,000 years. So that's my challenge.
That's wonderful. Hey, with that said, we're going to get out of here, but know that we love you very much. And just take a minute to think about your neighbor, to think about people who might be, let's say, your enemies. Think about loving them. Think about embracing all of humanity as if you give a damn. Good night.